joined us from the Middle East and Europe, and good afternoon for attendees who joined us from USA and Canada. My name is Dr. Tarek Azeldin, Research Institutional Official, Consultant and Medical Program Director, and I am pleased to be your host today. Just a little reminder for whom joined us today for the first time. After the overwhelming attendance and the standing ovation we received from the previous webinar titled How to Present a Successful Proposal and the IRB, we were encouraged to carry on with other exciting topics for research and researchers. These webinars are the fruits of a dedicated teamwork and efforts from Dammam Medical Complex, targeting research and researchers under the care and patronage of the CEO of Dammam Medical Complex, Dr. Zakaria Safran, and organized by the Training and Academic Affairs under the leadership of Dr. Malik Al-Mutairi, while the logistics are professionally executed by the event troop organization team. I wish now to give you a little introduction about the webinar series. Today, we are pleased to start the second webinar of a series of webinars accommodating all the modules of the Good Clinical Practice, abbreviated for GCP. As we explained before, attending all the 7 webinars and successfully completing the quiz at the end of the 7th and last webinar will qualify you to receive the Certificate of Completion of Good Clinical Practice, including 7 hours internationally verifiable CME or CPD. I wish to inform the audience that everyone can feel free to post his question using Twitter, #research_Saudi Vision 2030, and we will take them in order after the lecture. So the presenter, and if there will be an excess of question, then the time frame permits, the presenter will kindly answer them later in Twitter. Regarding the audio icon, it is located down to your left of the screen where you can easily unmute it. As we explained before, this GCP course is an essential international ethical and scientific quality standard for clinical trials. It also serves to protect the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of any trial subjects. Today, our second webinar will be titled IRBs/IECs, which stand for Institutional Review Board and Independent Ethics Committees. To present this exciting and essential topic, we are again pleased to invite Mr. Naeem Noordin, CEO and Managing Director, SIARA Limited UK. Mr. Naeem is a graduate in pharmacology with toxicology from King's College, University London, where he started his career as clinical pharmacokineticist. During his 20-year career, Mr. Naeem has held various positions of increasing seniority and is actually the CEO of SIARA Limited UK, which he founded in 2007. His company, highly specialized and focused organization offering training, development, and consultancy in all aspects of International Council for Harmonization and Good Clinical Practice and related guidelines, as well as for personal effectiveness and behavioral skills. Mr. Naeem brings with him over 20 years of experience in clinical development, training, consultancy, and education, spanning Europe, United States, Middle East, and Asia. Mr. Naeem is also a lecturer at Cranfield University, UK, and a certified facilitator and behavioral skills trainer. Mr. Naeem has worked extensively in the Middle East and Asia, developing and building clinical research capability with the regions. While in Saudi Arabia, Mr. Naeem was intimately involved and chosen to establish the structure of the Ministry of Health Ethics Committees and was heavily involved in developing the standard operating procedures and deploying the training for the Ethics Committee members nationally. Please welcome Mr. Naeem Noordin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarek, and good evening, and everybody welcome to the second lecture on our series, where I shall be talking about institutional review boards and IRBs and independent ethics committees. Once again, a big thank you to Dr. Tarek for providing me with the honor and privilege to speak with you all today. So what I'll start doing is I'll just share my screen and I'll go straight into the lecture. And so I'll speak for about an hour, 45 minutes, an hour or so. And then after the lecture, I'll be more than happy to take any questions you have from either yesterday's lecture or today's lecture. Okay, so can everybody see my screen? Yeah. Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just give you an understanding of what are the expectations from good clinical practice from ICH GCP on how this very important group of people, which we call the Institutional Review Board or IRB, or the Independent Ethics Committees, IEC, who they are and what do they actually do. So I have some objectives for this session. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you will understand the roles and the responsibilities of the IRB and IEC. You'll understand the required composition of the IRB and IEC as per ICH GCP. And finally, you'll understand the functions and operations of IRB's IEC. One thing you'll probably learn in clinical research, there are lots of abbreviations and acronyms, so you'll have to get a little bit used to those as well. So let's make a start. So those of you who joined us yesterday, a little bit of a recap from yesterday as to how this builds on from what we did yesterday. So if you remember yesterday, we went through the principles of good clinical practice, and there were 13 principles of GCP. And one of the principles of GCP actually stated, which was section 2, bullet 2.6, it stated that a trial should be conducted in compliance with a protocol that has received prior Institutional Review Board, IRB, or Independent Ethics Committee, IEC, approval or favorable opinion. So this is one of the principles of GCP. We cannot conduct any research without IRB approval. And then if you remember yesterday, I told you the ICH guidelines, they were made up of 8 sections from 1 all the way to number 8, and they talked about different roles. They talked about the role of the investigator, they talked about the role of the sponsor, and the third group of people that talked about was the role of the IRB's IECs. And that was section 3. So section 3 of the ICH guidelines talks about the roles and responsibilities of the Institutional Review Board and Independent Ethics Committees. So everything I'm going to tell you today is actually from the section 3 of the GCP guidelines, because these tell us how this very important group who's going to give us the approval to conduct research should comprise, and very importantly, how they should be functioning. So before I do that, I'll just do another little recap on some ethical principles. GCP is an ethical scientific quality standard. So when we talk about ethics, what do we mean ethical principles? Okay. So over here, I'm showing you 3 universally recognized ethical principles. So all research which is involving human subjects should be conducted according to these principles over here. The principles are of autonomy, beneficence and non-maleficence, I'll explain this, and justice. So these are 3 fundamental ethical aspects that when we are going to experiment in human subjects, we all must follow. So what do we mean by autonomy? Autonomy recognizes or acknowledges a subject's capacity to make personal choices. So this is informed consent. So all research is a personal choice. It's a voluntary decision, and that decision to participate in research must come from the individual themselves. Nobody else but the individual. And this is informed consent. So important one ethical principle, the rights of the subjects, informed consent. When we talk about beneficence and non-maleficence, what do we mean? Well, beneficence means maximizing the potential benefit and minimizing the potential harm. So this is very, very important. Yes, we understand we have to do research. There are risks in the research, but there are also hopefully benefits of the research. When we do research, we have to ensure that there's a good risk-benefit ratio. The risks should not outweigh the benefits. If there are risks in a protocol, in a research, how are you minimizing the risks? And I shall say more about that as we progress today. And the final is justice. This is the fairness and equity of subject selection. Well, this is saying you must be very fair on how you recruit subjects in a trial. You must not, for example, abuse certain patient populations, such as let's just do research on the impoverished or the poor people or the uneducated people. The benefits and risks of research must be distributed fairly. So these autonomy, informed consent, beneficence, non-maleficence, maximizing benefit, minimizing harm, and fairness on how you're recruiting, selecting subjects are very fundamental ethical principles. So when our important group of individuals in the IRB are going to review your process, your proposals, your research protocols, this will be in the back of their minds. They'll be thinking about this when they are reviewing your proposals. So now let's see. I've talked about these people, IRBs, IECs. I'll actually first of all tell you what is the difference between an IRB and an IEC. If you look at the GCP guidelines, they always say IRB/IEC. So what we'll do is we'll now very quickly have a look at what GCP says are the definitions of an IRB and an IEC. So an IEC, Independent Ethics Committee, who are they? Well, this is the definition of an Independent Ethics Committee. It's an independent body or a review board or a committee, can be institutional, regional, national, or supranational, consisted of medical professionals and non-medical members. So independent body, independent to whom? Well, independent to the researcher, independent to the sponsor of the proposal. So somebody who's totally independent to the research. But what they must be is they must be made up of medical professionals as well as non-medical professionals. And that's very, very important. So this group of individuals, we'll have some medical people on there, but we also have to have non-medical people on there. Okay. Independent group of people, what do they do? Well, this is it. It's their responsibility to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, and well-being of human subjects involved in a trial. So the right, safety, well-being of human subjects in a clinical trial. So if we take a step back and think about yesterday, what was the purpose of GCP? The purpose of GCP, if you remember the two pillars, one pillar was to protect the rights, the safety, well-being of clinical trial subjects. And this is what they are doing. And the other aspect was to make sure the data is complete, accurate, unbiased. So what these independent ethics committees are doing, they're making sure that any subject who enters a clinical trial or research, their rights, their safety, their well-being are being protected, and also that they provide the public assurance of that protection. And how do they do it? Well, they're going to review your proposals. So they will review your proposal, your trial. They will review the suitability of the investigator. So they want to know who is the researcher. They want to know the facilities. Where will this be performed? Where will the research be performed? They want to know how will you document this? And very, very importantly, they will want to look at your informed consent. How are you taking informed consent from subjects? So, and we'll go into a little bit more detail very shortly. So independent body, medical, non-medical, what are they doing? They are protecting the rights, the safety, the well-being of clinical trial subjects. So that's an independent ethics committee. Then what is an institutional review board or an IRB? Now, here is the definition of an IRB. It says an IRB is an independent body constituted of medical, scientific, and non-scientific members whose responsibility is to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, well-being of humans involved in the trial. So basically exactly the same as an IEC. They're independent, medical, non-scientific members, and what they're doing is ensuring the protection, rights, safety, and well-being of subjects. And how do they do it? Well, by reviewing, approving, providing continual review of the protocol, and very importantly, looking at documentation on how consent is taken. So they are exactly the same. It's just a terminology. When GCP was being developed in the European Union, we called our independent ethics committees. In the US, the term institutional review board was used. So they're exactly the same people, the same group, and the same rules that are stated in section 3 of the GCP guidelines apply to them all. So this is who they are. So what are they going to do? You say, well, Naeem, you said they're going to protect the rights, safety, and well-being of subjects. How are they going to do it? Well, this is it. As IRB members, we are going to protect the rights, safety, well-being of subjects with special attention to vulnerable subjects. Now, vulnerable subjects, what do we mean by vulnerable subjects? Well, vulnerable subjects are those subjects who may not be able to give consent, fully informed consent, or are in situations where the consent may not be fully informed. So, for example, vulnerable population would be minors or children or pediatric trials. Vulnerable populations could be in patients with mental impairments, or very poor patients are vulnerable, disadvantaged individuals. So vulnerable subjects, and when I talk about consent in tomorrow's lecture, I'll say more about vulnerable subjects. Okay, so they're looking at subjects, very important. What they'll do is they will review the protocol and any associated documents that are provided for review within a reasonable time and document its view in writing. So what GCP is saying, as an IRB, you are going to review the protocol, you're going to review all associated documents. And associated documents include, for example, informed consent forms. It can include any other information that would be useful for the IRB to make a decision on whether or not to approve this protocol. And within a reasonable time. So as an IRB, you have a responsibility to establish a timeline as how long you will take to review research when it's submitted to you. And very importantly, you will document your views in writing. So as researchers, we need to know that when we want to do any form of research, we need to submit our proposal, our associate documents to our IRBs. We will know they will review in a reasonable timeline. And very importantly, we need the approval written to us so that we can start our research. They will consider the qualifications of the investigator for the proposed trial. So they would want to see your CV. Are you qualified to do the research? Do you have any GCP training, for example? They will look at as well. They want to make sure the right individuals are conducting the trial. And what our IRBs do, they don't just have a role in the beginning of research. They will not just review the research, provide you the approval, and that's the end of the story. It is not. It continues. Throughout your research as it's progressing, our IRBs want to be doing a continual review of the research. I shall be telling you what GCP says as to what this review should include. And very importantly, they will review the informed consent form in a lot of detail, which I'll say more about tomorrow, and also the consenting procedures. So we can see nicely building up as to what they're doing. What else do we expect them to do? Well, they're going to look at any ethical concerns and regulatory requirements are being addressed for any non-therapeutic trials. So there could be trials which are non-therapeutic, for example, some model of pain types of trials. They want to see what are the ethics involved around that. They need to know regulatory requirements. So as IRB members, our members should know what the country's regulations are mandating for every aspect of research. Now, one thing very, very important of IRB responsibilities is as you as investigators or researchers have to be trained in GCP, IRBs also need to be qualified to review a research proposal. If you remember yesterday, I mentioned a very important document, which is the foundation of clinical research. That is the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration of Helsinki in fact states in one of the paragraphs regarding IRBs that every IRB should be appropriately qualified and trained to perform their function. So IRB members should all also have GCP training. No one is safe from GCP training. Everyone has to have it. So what they do is they will also determine any ethical concerns and regulatory requirements for trials where prior consent of the subject is not possible. Now, what do we mean by prior consent of the subject is not possible? Now, it could be very applicable in the current status we have at the moment when we have all these COVID trials happening. Subjects are coming in unconscious and we need to put them in a research. How do we do it? So this is what our ethics committees, our IRBs want to know is how will consent be taken? Again, I shall elucidate more tomorrow on that. They will review the amount and method of payment that's given to subjects to ensure that neither presents problem or any coercion or undue influence to the subjects. The question is, do we pay our subjects to participate in research? Now, if you think about it, if you start paying them, that could be coercion. Yeah? So what we do is we do not pay subjects to be in research. The only time we will pay subjects to be in research is if we're doing healthy volunteer studies. Because what we do is we pay them for the inconvenience and the risk, and they will get compensated for their time for being in the study. Patients are entering the study for a potential therapeutic benefit. It is a choice. What's very, very important is if any payment is going to be made to a subject, the IRBs want to know what it is. What we can do is we can actually reimburse some costs to our patients. So for example, if the patients have to come into the study and they want to come by taxi, we will reimburse you for the taxi. If they have to stay the whole day in the hospital and they want to have lunch, they have to go and buy the lunch, we'll reimburse you for the lunch. But what's important is we will not say here's 500 SARS to have a sandwich. Yeah? It has to be very, very reasonable. And our IRBs are going to look at that and they're going to question that. This is clearly mentioned in GCP that you have to review the payment. So that's what they're going to be looking at. And if there is any payment that's going to be made, they want to make sure that this is clearly documented in the informed consent form. So they will look that, yes, if you're paying, it must be in the consent form. The subject should clearly know that, yes, if you're going to be reimbursed, this is the procedure and this is how we will give you this reimbursement. So these are some of the key type of responsibilities the IRBs are doing. So as they're seeing your research coming in, they have to look at all of these aspects. So having said that, they've got some responsibilities. You put a proposal on the desk. So the committee gets a proposal. So when they look at this proposal, what are they looking at? And I'm just going to explain this to you a little bit now. So as researchers, when you're developing your research, you're doing your protocols, I want you to think about this because this is what the ethics committees want to know. Because why they want to know this? Because this will ensure that we have a good ethical research and we're doing good research. So here are some of the ethical requirements. So one thing, or the first thing they will look at is what is the social value of doing this research? Yeah? And what do we mean by that? So this says, does the research pose a clinically, scientifically, or sociable, valuable question that will contribute to knowledge about health and will be useful in improving research, improving health? Research should be responsive to health needs and priorities. What this means is if you are going to do a research, there has to be some value for this research. There's no point repeating research which is already done. That is just exposing patients to potential risk. For what reason? So this is something very important, is what new information, how is this going to benefit mankind? This is the social value. So they'll look at the social value. What is the purpose? And also what they look very importantly is at the scientific validity. Is this a scientifically valid proposal? on the Ethics Committee Institutional Review Board, you have medical, scientific, non-medical individuals. We have the expertise in there to understand the science of the research as well. So they will look at the design of the research. They will look at your endpoints. Do your endpoints match the objectives of your research? They will look at your methods. They will see how are you going to collect data? How are you going to interpret data? Is it scientifically valid? So not just the social aspect, but the scientific aspect as well. So this is saying, do you know what? This looks like a good scientific question, which is going to be backed by scientific, true, good science. So they will look at that. They do a lot more. They will also then see, okay, you've got a good scientific research, good proposal, good protocol. Then they will look at this justice, the fair subject selection. Where are you getting these subjects from? They want to know the process, the outcomes of subjects. Is it fair? How are you minimizing any vulnerability or risks? What is happening? Where are you getting the subjects from? So for example, you're not just doing the study somewhere in Africa because the people are poor, they've got no choice, they'll be in the research. No, no, no. We're going to do it where there's an option, where the subjects have an option to make a decision to go in the research or not. Then they look at that. They will look at the risk-benefit ratio. So this is now looking at beneficence and non-maleficence coming in. So they will see what are the benefits of here. So they will really need to know what are the benefits. Okay? How will the subjects benefit from the research? Not just the subjects, but the future patient population. How will they benefit from this? If there are risks in the research, and we understand there will be risks, how are you minimizing these risks? You know, what is this? How will the subjects be taken care of? And I'm going to say more about that in a very short while as well. So they look at fair subject selection, the justice. They're looking at favorable risk-benefit ratio, beneficence, non-maleficence. What else will be they looking at? They will obviously, they are independent. One very, very important point when we look in, I'll talk about in a very short while, is when we look at the composition of an ethics committee, independence is very, very important. And I'll explain that shortly. So if you bear with me, I'll come back to that in a very short while. So they will also then look at informed consent. This is the autonomy, the ethical principle of autonomy. Informed consent. They want to know how is informed consent being taken. According to GCP, good clinical practice, informed consent must be a documented process. GCP says for every research, there has to be an informed consent form. So a document. What goes inside this document, I shall tell you in tomorrow's lecture. So they will look at the informed consent form, they will scrutinize it. They will read it very carefully, and they will think, if I am a patient, would I understand this? This is the value when we look at the composition of an ethics committee having a non-medical, non-scientific person on the committee. So this person who doesn't understand science, because that's what most of the patients in the real world are like, yes, they will look at the consent form and they will read it. They will say this, if I was a patient, would I understand this? So this is a big challenge because informed consent, writing a consent form is an art. It has to be written in a language that a lay person will understand. And I'll explain lay people to you tomorrow. So they will look at the consent form, but then also they want to know is how do you take consent? Who takes consent? We want to know that. So that's the autonomy aspect. So they're going to look at that. And then they look at how are the subjects being respected. Remember definition of GCP, rights, safety, well-being, clinical trial subjects, respecting their rights. They want to see how are you respecting them. So the rights is coming over here. Everything they're doing is tying in with what good clinical practice is asking for. So they will look at during the clinical research, how are you respecting the subjects? Again, I'll say more about this very shortly. So they will be looking at that as well. So there you go. So now we know our IRBs are a group of lovely people who have a remit, and their remit is to protect the right, safety, well-being of clinical trial subjects. How will they do it? Well, they will review the proposal, they will review the consent form, and they will review any other documentation. And when they review this, what are they reviewing? They're reviewing the social aspect, the scientific aspect, the autonomy, the beneficence, non-maleficence, and also the justice. They'll be looking at all of that. So now, having said that, what is the ethics committee made up of? Who can be on the ethics committee or the IRB? And now I'll say a few words about the composition and the functions of an IRB IEC. Now, this is all according to Good Clinical Practice, GCP Section 3. And what it says is your ethics committee must consist of members who collectively have the qualifications and experience to review and evaluate the science, the medical aspects, and ethics of the proposed trial. Very importantly, the qualifications and experience to review, evaluate the science. Therefore, this team of people must be comprised of these individuals. Yeah? So they would know how to look at a protocol and review it. They will understand the ethics of the research. So when they say ethics, they need to have GCP training or some form of ethical training. So it consists of members who together can review this. How many should there be? GCP says there should be at least 5 members. So as a minimum, there should be 5 members in an IRB at any time point. So 5 members. Now, ICH or GCP is giving this as a minimum. If you look around the world, the numbers vary considerably. Some IRBs are 7, some are 10, some are 15, but not a single one will be below 5. If the number is below 5, then what we have is non-compliance to good clinical practice, and that ethics IRB is not in compliance with GCP, so they cannot review our research. There must be at least 1 member whose primary area of interest is in a non-scientific area. So this is that very important individual who is not a scientist. So we need somebody there who's non-scientific. Very importantly, this IRB ethics composition has to be documented. So the IRBs document who are our members, and when we met, who met to review a proposal. All of this has to be documented. And if you remember yesterday, I mentioned one of the big differences between clinical research and medical practice is the volume of documentation that's required. Everything GCP says has to be documented because that is our evidence that we followed research ethics. And in 1 member who is independent of the institution trial site. Now what happens is when we look at IRBs in an institution, the IRB is usually part of the institution, or they're affiliated to the institution. That is okay to do. However, when the IRB is comprised or when it's made, there must be at least 1 person who is independent of the institution. So somebody who does not work for the institution, has nothing to do with the institution, they must be a member of the institution. So at least 5 members, 1 member whose primary area is in a non-scientific interest, and 1 member who's independent of the trial. So what do our lovely IRB members actually do? Well, what they will do is they will get together and at announced meetings. So GCP says there should be announced meetings. Therefore, you should know as researchers, my IRB, when do they actually meet? That there should be a schedule somewhere which says, IRBs meet on this date. So it says they make decision at announced meetings at which at least a quorum, as stipulated in written procedures, is present. Now, what does quorum actually mean? And I'll explain that. So what happens is, in real life, IRBs have a group of members. Because remember, IRBs is usually sometimes a voluntary participation by lots of people, yes? They have a full daytime job, but then they're members of an IRB as well. So an IRB can have about, say, on their books, 30 members, yeah, or 20 members, for example. However, it's going to be not reasonable for all 20 to meet at the same time to have a meeting. So what good clinical practice states is you should have at least a quorum. So a quorum is a group or a number, but it doesn't tell you what number it should be. All we know, it has to be minimum of 5. But what GCP says this is that your quorum should be defined in your written procedures. So what this is actually saying now is that every IRB, however you are functioning, you must have written procedures. And we call these written procedures standard operating procedures, or SOPs. So in your SOP, you will say our quorum is, for example, 70% of the total number of IRB members. That's just an example for you. Okay? So there we have. So we have a group who will meet and who will discuss with a minimum number as stipulated in their written procedures. Now, very importantly, GCP states that only members who've participated in the review and discussion will provide or vote and provide their opinion. That's very, very important. So only those who got together, discussed this, and made the decision would vote. Okay. Now, what usually happens is, as researchers, sometimes you may actually go and present your research. Yeah, this is a research I want to present. I want to tell you what it's about, which is fine. Sometimes IRB members actually say that, you know, investigative research, can you come to the meeting and explain, clarify things for us? Allowed to do that. Yeah. However, once you've presented, you must leave, because any deliberations must occur without the investigator or the researcher there. Now, what happens? What else do we do? The IRB has to do conducting an initial and continual review of the research. So initial and continuing, and I'll tell you what this is in a minute. Very importantly, something which is made very clear in GCP is that you have a protocol, you have a proposal. Your IRBs have said, yes, it is fine. We give you approval to conduct the research as your proposal is saying. When they say that, they clearly mean you cannot deviate from this, because that is all we have given you approval for. So they have to make it very clear to you that no deviations or changes from the protocol should be initiated without their written approval. So if, for example, you've done a protocol or proposal and you want to change it, you cannot implement any change without IRB approval. You have to submit your amendment, get their approval, and then implement it. However, there is an exception. And the exception is if, for example, you need to eliminate an immediate hazard to the subject, then you can implement a change. So something, you have the proposal, this is how I'm going to treat subjects, something happened to the subjects, and what you're going to do deviates from the protocol, but to eliminate a hazard to that subject, you are allowed to do that. But once you do that, you must let the IRB know, look, this is what I've done. Okay? Or if there are any logistical or minor changes, such as a change in a phone number, change in the clinical monitor of the study, that's an administrative change that can be done. But any other deviation from the protocol, from the proposal, before it's implemented, your IRB has to provide you the approval or the view opinion on it. Now, as I mentioned, what about their ongoing review? So what happens during the ongoing review? Okay. So as you're conducting the research, the protocol, maybe whatever type of research it is, you must keep your IRBs informed of what is happening. So they want to know if you've deviated from the protocol, or were there any immediate hazards to the subjects, you inform your IRBs. If there are any changes that increase the risk to the subjects or significantly affect the conduct of the trial, you must let your IRB know that. So as a researcher, you have got an obligation, when we look at investigator obligations towards the end of the series, to have an ongoing communication with your IRB. You have to keep them informed of what is happening in your research. Something very important is you have to let them know of all adverse drug reactions, or ADRs, that are both serious and unexpected. And I will explain these to you in a little bit more detail in our safety section. But if there are any adverse events occurring or serious adverse events, and what GCP does, it gives you a definition of what an adverse event is and what a serious adverse event is. And you have to let your IRBs know that. One of our webinars is on safety reporting, and I will go into a lot more detail about adverse events, adverse drug reactions, and serious adverse events, and serious unexpected adverse reactions in that lecture. So I would like to hold that for now, and I'll address that later. So what we need to be comfortable in knowing here is that safety information should be sent to our IRBs. That is their role, to provide an ongoing review to protect the rights and the safety of the subjects. What else do they want to know? They want to know any new information that will adversely affect the safety of the subjects and the conduct of the clinical research. They would want to know that as well. So what happens is, when you are working with the IRBs, they will provide you an approval letter, if they approve your research. And on that letter, they will clearly tell you how frequently they want you to communicate with them. They will tell you what information they expect you to provide them. This is good clinical practice. This is meeting international requirements on the conduct of clinical research. What else do we have to know about our IRBs? Well, again, section 3.2 goes into a lot of detail. It clearly states that every IRB must perform its functions per written standard operating procedures. So every IRB will have a written procedure from A to Z on how they function. They must comply with good clinical practice. What does that mean? Well, that means you must follow section 3.0 of the GCP guidelines, which I am talking about now. Okay? And you must follow your local regulatory requirements. So what are your country regulations doing? For example, in the US, they will follow the FDA regulations. In the European Union, we will follow the European Union Clinical Trial Directive. So they will follow that. They must maintain written records of activities and meeting minutes. Now, this is very, very important. Every time an IRB is going to meet, they have their quorum, they have the discussion, all of these minutes have to be documented. So they will be documenting every decision they make, every discussion that happened or whatever, and they will put it in writing. And these have to be maintained. This is their responsibilities. Now, what can happen, I mentioned earlier on, they allow investigators to provide trial information, but the investigators are not allowed to vote. Okay? So if as a researcher, you want to present your research, you can do that, but you cannot vote. Now, what else? Now, what if, for example, I am a researcher, but I am also a member of my IRB? And it's my research which is going to be discussed. If that's a scenario, then you will not be a member for that meeting where your protocol is going to be discussed. You will not be part of the quorum. That's what will happen. Now, what if? Now, if you remember, I said earlier on, IRBs must have the appropriate qualifications and expertise to review a research proposal. What if they don't have that? Well, what GCP says is, if, for example, a situation arises when an IRB does not have the expertise, they can invite an expert. So let's say, for example, we are all an IRB. All of us are one nice, lovely IRB. And today we're going to review a pediatric clinical trial. But none of us are pediatricians. Yeah, let's say it's an oncology pediatric trial. We're oncologists, but we're not pediatricians. Then as an IRB, what we can do is we can invite a pediatrician who's an oncologist to attend our meeting and provide us any clarifications we need, provide us the expert advice. They can do that. But this expert cannot vote or provide an opinion. We will do that as an IRB because we've got all the information we need now. If that happens, all of this is actually documented in the meeting minutes. So it's very important. Okay. Now, I mentioned that IRBs have to retain their documentation and all the documents. GCP states, yes, you do. GCP says that IRBs will retain all of the documents for a period of at least 3 years after completion of the clinical trial. So what this means is, as an IRB, you're reviewing, for example, my research, all of the documentation related to my research, once my research is finished, 3 years after that, you can destroy it. This is what it means. Yeah? So they will have to keep it. But what's very important, they have to make it available upon request from the regulatory authorities. So if the regulators say, look, we're coming to you as an IRB and we want to do an inspection of you, they have to disclose all their documents to the regulatory authorities. Now, something else which is clearly stated within the GCP guidelines is that IRBs, whenever you are meeting, you're having your meeting, you have to have a membership list. So we know exactly when this meeting occurred that the right individuals were sitting. So there were at least 5 people. There was an independent person there. There was a non-scientific person there. And this list will be maintained and you will keep it. But if the sponsor or the regulatory authority or the investigator wants to see the list, they will make it available. GCP is saying that. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a guidance as to what are the expectations from an IRB according to GCP. Very, very importantly, what they're doing is they're putting the subjects first. That is what they're doing. Okay? So when I say that, what a little bit of the criteria, and I want us to think as researchers, let's look at this from the view of an IRB. What does this approval actually say? What does it mean? What are they thinking about? So this is to add on to what I mentioned a little bit earlier on. They want to know, and we purely understand, there are going to be risks in research, especially if we're doing phase 2, phase 3 trials, when there's a product which is not licensed yet, it's still under experimentation. We don't even know the safety profile yet, because this is what we're trying to establish. We know there's a risk. They want to know, how are the risks of this going to be minimized? What procedures are used? Are they going to be consistent with good research design? Are you not unnecessarily exposing subjects to risk? And whenever possible, are you already being performed or diagnostic or treatment, appropriate, I got tongue-tied there. Whenever appropriate, are already being performed for diagnostic and treatment purposes. So what we want to know is, yes, there's a risk. How are you going to handle or manage the risk? What is your study design saying on how these risks are going to be managed? For example, if it's a product, they have some issues with the QT interval. How often, how frequently are you doing ECGs? Who is reviewing the ECGs? What will happen? So these are the things they will look for. They have to ensure that the risks are reasonable in relation to the benefits. Now, this is very important. For example, I'll give you an example here. We know some oncology products are very toxic. They've got very bad side effect profile, but the benefit is they may increase survival. They may offer a potential cure. So there's always this benefit they look at. They look at the risks. They look at the knowledge we have about the risks. We need to know, what do you expect the risks to happen? They will then look, obviously, as I mentioned, at the selection of subjects. Again, they will look at how consent is being done. And I'm really going to focus on that because that is one of the key aspects they're looking for. So when you're doing your research, you have to be very transparent in your proposals, your protocols, that this is how consent is being done, and this consent is being done in line with good clinical practice. That's what is being done in line with. Looking at the research plan, what are the provisions for safeguarding and monitoring and collecting data to protect the safety of the research subjects is what they look at. Very importantly, they're also going to look at the confidentiality of personal data. Who is going to have access to this data? They want to know, how will you protect the confidentiality of the subjects? The confidentiality of the subjects is very, very important. They want to know, how is that going to be protected? When data of these individuals is taken out of the institution, how is that data protected? How is it anonymized, for example? They want to know that. And they will also look at if there are any vulnerable populations in the studies. How is any coercion or undue influence going to happen? How are you going to prevent that from happening? And if they're quite comfortable, happy with all of that, the scientific value, the social value, looking at the safety, looking at the risks, looking at the consenting procedures, looking at the rights, the safety, only then will they say, you know what, we want to give you approval to go ahead and do this research. But once we're doing this research, the IRBs and their role is not finishing there. It's all the way continuing across until the study, your research is completed. The IRBs will be doing a continual review of the research. So that is what Section 3 of the GCP guidelines is actually saying about IRBs, the roles and the functions. What's very, very importantly is every institution which is going to conduct a research study must meet these minimum requirements of good clinical practice. So for example, when a sponsor is going to do, when I say sponsor, a big pharmaceutical company or biotechnology company, or when we see a lot more phase 2, phase 3 trials coming into the kingdom or into the region, all our expectations are that every IRB meets GCP requirements. What we will want is a statement from IRB saying we are in compliance with good ICH, GCP, and local regulations. Very, very important. If an IRB does not keep minutes, they're not comprised according to ICH, GCP, they cannot do clinical research. They cannot do research. So on that note, I'll just do a little bit of a recap on our objectives. So I hope you understand now the roles and responsibilities of the IRBs, IECs. I hope you understand now the composition of the IRB, IEC as per good clinical practice, and you understand the functions and operations of an IRB, IEC. Now, why it's important for us research for us to know this, because we are working with them. IRBs are there to help you. They are an ethical framework to give you advice. Yes, they are crucial. My advice is lean on them for advice. You know, this is their resource there for you. They are the gatekeepers to allow us to do research. If you remember, I said yesterday, before we do any research, we need regulatory approval, especially for phase 2, 3 trials, and then we need ethical approval. Without ethical approval, we cannot do any research at all. And on that note, I think I shall stop here because I think I've spoken for an hour now, and I shall stop sharing my screen, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions you have on either today or yesterday. So
thank you so much, Mr. Naeem.